Good evening, everybody. It's great to see such a turnout. Welcome to the Library of Virginia as we celebrate the launch of the book, Justice for Ourselves, Black Virginians Claim Their Freedom After Slavery, published by the University of Virginia Press in association with the Library of Virginia. My name is Dennis Clark, and I'm the librarian of Virginia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this wonderful panel. It's quite appropriate that we launch Justice for Ourselves here at the Library of Virginia, growing out of the library's long-standing Dictionary of Virginia Biography, a work such as this, telling the stories of the remarkable men and women who persevered during the decades after the Civil War to create a new world for themselves and for future generations, could only have been done here with the access to the library's collections of primary sources of local, state, federal documents, genealogical records, newspapers, and the like. The library's efforts to digitize many of those materials were part of Virginia Untold and the Virginia Chronicle, and it is that work that made this book possible. I'd like to introduce tonight's panel for the conversation. Co-authors John Deal and Mary Julienne are currently historians at the Library of Virginia, working in the Education and Outreach Unit, while co-author Brent Tarter is a retired historian at the library. I'm especially pleased to welcome Representative Jennifer McClellan, the first Black Congresswoman from Virginia, former member of the House of Delegates and the Virginia Senate. Our Congresswoman wrote the foreword for the book. Rounding out the panel is Ajena Cason Rogers, a National Park Service supervisory park ranger who wrote, absolutely. Ms. Rogers wrote the afterword and is also a descendant of James A. Fields, one of the legislatures featured in Justice for Ourselves. And I'll now turn the program over to Brent. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, thank you all for coming out. We've been wanting to read a book like this for decades, but nobody else would write it. Our chance to write it arose out of a long cooperative project that the library's Dictionary of Virginia Biography Project engaged in with the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities online encyclopedia, with financial assistance from the General Assembly's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Commission and from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We were able to invite scores of historians and family historians and local historians and librarians and other people with interest in Virginia history to write several hundred entries for the online Encyclopedia of Virginia, focusing on some of the important events and some of the important institutions and some of the important people in the final third of the 19th century after the final abolition of slavery. The Dictionary of Virginia Biography's contribution to this was to invite and help various scholars write biographies of leading civic leaders, educators, ministers, entrepreneurs, and as many of the important political leaders as we could identify. We commissioned and published online biographies of more than 100 Black Virginia men who served in the Constitutional Convention of 1867 and 8 and or in the two houses of the General Assembly between then and the 1890s. Nobody had ever written up a proper biography of any of those people. All we had to go on in the beginning is two pieces of pioneering scholarship by early Black historians. Alrutheus Taylor published The Negro and Reconstruction in Virginia almost exactly 100 years ago. It focuses on the politics of the second half of the 1860s. And Luther P. Jackson of Virginia State University, about 20 years later, published Negro office holders in Virginia, 1865 to 1895, the first small reference work that identifies the black members of the General Assembly who were the first office holders ever of African descent to serve in Virginia. Those are all online at the Encyclopedia of Virginia website. The biographies are also all available on the Dictionary of Virginia Biography site at the Library of Virginia and the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Commission website. The researchers who worked on this research discovered so much new information, so many new details, so many splendid anecdotes and so many good stories about people that nobody ever heard of, that it caused John and Mary and me and the people at the Encyclopedia of Virginia to revise our understandings of the late 19th century completely. Not just for the experiences of black people, but for the experiences of white people also. Insomuch that John Deal suggested, nobody else has written a book that we can read, let's write it. So we went back through all this material that all of these researchers had uncovered. Much of it was quite new, never been seen by any other researcher before. And we refashioned all those encyclopedia entries into a narrative that recounts some of the experiences of black Virginians after the final end of slavery. We carry the story up to the end of the century, and we were very pleased to be able to cover the entire state. We had a few good studies on localities, but we wanted to know, was there a uniform experience or were there diversity of experience in the various portions of the state? And anyway, so we made a book. We hope that you will read it. We're doing this panel to encourage you to get interested in this subject. I mean, this is a badly neglected subject, coming on the immediate aftermath of the abolition of slavery, which is the most important event in American history, most important event in Virginia's history. How did the formerly enslaved people adapt to a new life and freedom in the face of all of the obstacles that they faced? That, in short, is what the book is about. We're glad you're here. Hope you're interested. Let's talk about it. Jennifer McClellan, you're a longtime black legislator. Why is this book important to you?
Well, thank you. Well, it's the first time my name has appeared in a published book on the front, so I am pretty excited. And I agreed to do the foreword while I was chair of the Virginia Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Commission, which was probably one of the highlights of my state legislative experience, because that commission sort of became the default state agency that really focused on commemorating Virginia African American history. And I became chair, I became a member of the commission and was vice chair of the commission when I was in the House, and became chair in 2014, right as we were beginning the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And it became very clear that while Virginia loves its commemorations, it doesn't always tell all of the story. And I wanted to know more of the story. I said, well, if they're not going to do it, we're going to do it. But for me personally, I'm the first member of my family that we know of, that we can document, was born in Virginia. My parents, my mom was born in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi in the 1930s. My father was born in Nashville, Tennessee in the 1920s. His father was born in Alabama at the turn of the century. And in my family, I was a history nerd, my dad was a history nerd, because it was our family story. And there were stories that were told and passed down, and we were lucky because my father's grandfather happened to write a book. He had founded a school with my dad's grandmother in Centerville, Alabama. It was one of the Rosewood schools. He had been convinced to write his history. And so we knew what he experienced. And we knew those stories. They were a part of what inspired me to run for office in the first place. Well, then I walk in the General Assembly as a 32-year-old black woman from the most Democratic district in the state in 2006, in a body that was mostly white Republican men over 50. And I very quickly figured out everybody's political views are shaped by their life experiences, what they know. If I'm going to get anything done, I need to understand what led you to believe what you believe. More importantly, I need to share what led me to believe what I believe. And what I very quickly figured out with my most of my white colleagues, not just the Republicans, but the Democrats too, they didn't know this history. And depending on how much time we have, I have 3 stories I'd like to share. Not right now. We'll see if we come back to them in the Q&A. I'll tell you the first one, though, very quickly. I can't remember exactly. I think it was 2010 or it was when McDonald was governor. We had a bill that came to the House floor that would have required, for the first time, a government-issued photo ID. And I stood on the House floor and I told my great-grandfather's story about how he had to take a literacy test and find 3 white men to vouch for him just to be able to register to vote. That when he got all the questions right, the registrar said, and I only use this word in a direct quote, but the registrar said, "I need more questions because this nigger got them all right." He got those right, he got registered to vote. And I told that story on the House floor as to why the government-issued photo ID bill, why the Black Caucus was against it, because we all have a personal story like that, and how the legacy of Jim Crow didn't go away when the Voting Rights Act passed. Well, that bill went back to committee. A week later, we're having dinner with Bob McDonnell. And he asks, "How do you think we're doing with race relations in Virginia?" "How much time you got, Governor?" And I said, pretty much what I just told you, that as more people who lived during Jim Crow are dying and their stories are not being told, people don't realize how what they think is innocuous exacerbates inequity. He's like, "Well, give me an example." I told him about this bill. He said, "Well, why is that a problem?" I said, "Governor, do you know that there are people in Virginia born as late as 1940 who don't have a birth certificate? And you need a birth certificate to get a government-issued photo ID." "Well, I didn't know that." "Well, of course you didn't. You're a middle-aged white guy who grew up in Fairfax. You weren't taught that in school. You had no reason to know it in your family." To his credit, the following year, when a bill made it to his desk requiring a photo ID, he amended it because he remembered our conversation. That's why this book is important. Because every policy you can think of, every system you can think of, every issue you can think of, the legacy of 300 plus years of slavery and Jim Crow means we have inequity. And we will not be able to unwind that inequity if we don't know how we got there. And if we don't know, even people who think, "Well, I'm not racist." Okay, but you're exacerbating inequity. And here's why. That's why this book is important.
Thank you. Ajena Rogers, you're a historian of National Park Service, and you take history to ordinary people, not real historians and academics. What makes this book important to you?
Thank you, Brent. What makes this book important to me is the fact that it can put these stories in the hands of many people. It is a book that just shows that all across Virginia, there are ordinary Virginians who made a big difference, some within their small area, some within the larger area. And there are stories that haven't been told as much. They were told, but maybe not heard as broadly, like you were talking about, Governor McDonald. They are stories that, for example, the story of my family, told right within our household, but I didn't know it meant anything bigger than what was out inside the household. In fact, my grandmother, Margaret Fields Johnson, is the granddaughter of James A. Fields. And for years, we would drive in Newport News, and she'd point down 27th Street as we were heading to her church and goes, "Yeah, I was born in that house down there." Well, it turns out it's the James A. Fields house now. It's on the Virginia Register, and it was the site of the first black hospital in Newport News, Virginia. But yeah, I was just... And then she would tell us the stories that she remembered about James Fields. He passed before she was born, but she knew her grandmother, his wife, Carrie, very well. And she would tell us the stories that he was a legislator, that he was an educator, that he was, in the House of Delegates and a huge property owner. And she got those stories and showed us in this book that was in a drawer in the study by Luther P. Jackson, who happened to be her professor at Virginia State University. So when these were things that were all around me, but I didn't know that they were important, because in school, when you learn about great Virginians, they weren't talking about James Fields. They weren't talking about the people that are in this book necessarily. So to help, it helps give a sense of pride and a sense of position. I'm as Virginia-centric as anybody can be. If you've met me within the first 5 minutes and I haven't told you I'm Virginian, then check my head for fever. But I enjoy having this book because it shows the role that people who looked like me played so many years ago, and that we survived and that we thrived. And because they were so committed, we are here.
Thank you. I'll ask John Deal and Mary Julienne, who it was a great deal of fun to work with on this book, to give us a brief preview of some of the major themes that the book treats.
Well, thank you, Brent, and I will definitely take credit or blame for the book, and it dovetails with what the Congresswoman and Ajena were talking about. I didn't learn this stuff in school either, and I'm sure most of us did not learn this stuff, and if we learned anything about what we call the Reconstruction period, we learned the wrong things, and which might be worse. And we had learned so much, and I learned so much on the DVB that I thought it was worth sharing. And Ajena mentioned something that is important, and it goes to the heart of the DVB project, is that history is made by people. It's not, the longue durée and all these patterns and whatnot. It is people on the ground doing things. And that's one of the themes that really resonated with me for the book, because I wanted us to make sure that we sort of punctured holes in this idea that African Americans were sort of passive recipients of sort of that federal largesse in that post-Civil War period. And that's obviously just not true. And it started from even before the war was over. In February of 1865, down in Norfolk, African Americans are gathering and they're petitioning the Union Army, which was in control, and the president to make sure they looked out for their rights once the war was over. And the day after Richmond fell, there was a gathering of Black Virginians, and they were saying very similar things, and saying we already understand what rights we are entitled to. And it goes toward the heart of the book itself, and I'm going to look at my notes because claim justice for ourselves. The full quote comes from June 1865, and it's, "Give us the suffrage, and you may rely upon us to secure justice for ourselves." And it's all those action verbs, right? And it's secure, and that dovetails with the idea of claim. And for me, it's always resonated. If given any opportunity, Black Virginians were ready, willing, and able to claim and to actively define freedom for themselves. And we see this throughout the book in terms of politics, in terms of business, in commerce. And it'll come up more than once, especially in terms of education. And this sort of active is activity and agency, it was really spoke to me throughout the book.
Yeah, and like John mentioned, the book title comes from this address by Black men who are telling the world this is why we should have the right to vote and other rights as, now that slavery is over, we'll become citizens of the United States. But using like their words, centering Black voices was very important part of this book. And it can be tricky because, they're not like a lot of diaries or, letters. But, their voices are there in lots of public documents, many of which, live here in this building, and that archivists in the library are, working to make available, online or, to come and research here. But, things like, we can hear these people explaining what's important to them, in the actions they take, but also, the speeches of the legislators or the convention members. We are here, to build a new Virginia is, what Willis Hodges told the members of the convention of 1867, 68. So, and, things like newspapers, Hampton University or Hampton Institute, published the Southern Workman. And former students would write in, talking about like their lives, where they've settled, teachers describing their, conditions of their schools, their successes in business, property they've purchased, being able to, to hear all those people, explain their accomplishments and, their fears after the war. It was very. You'll find a lot of quotations in this book because we wanted people to speak for themselves as much as possible.
Jennifer McClellan, Ajena Rogers, were there any particular themes that struck you?
I think the tenacity and resilience of Black Americans, and how the story of America, which is only now starting to be told, was how do we make the ideals upon which we were founded true for everybody? That's been the fight. And still is, that's exactly right. And this book tells the story of a beginning of a cycle that we're still playing out. So what this book does is tell how after the war, during Reconstruction, formerly enslaved Virginians built, they weren't given, built social, political, and economic power, and how they understood that the key to that was education. There's a reason it was illegal to teach your slaves how to read. And that every time in American history there has been a gain by Black people specifically, marginalized people generally, social, political, and economic power, there's a backlash that includes three things: violence, racial terror lynchings, propaganda, the lost cause narrative and the lie of white supremacy, and voter suppression. This was the beginning of the cycle. And again, once you learn that history, the full history, you begin to recognize the pattern. And if you recognize the pattern, you know we're in the backlash right now. Different propaganda, different violence, different voter suppression, same cycle, same reason. But this is the beginning of the story that most people don't know. And it's why the fight at the center of the backlash is always education and voting. When you know that, you know how to fight the backlash.
You stole what I was going to say. But I'm good, and I can add on. No, that's exactly is what struck me. And as both a public historian and a descendant, I I see and I witness and I look at this, at these stories as a way that we can keep the fight moving in the right direction. It gives a sort of a handbook, a primer of how can we have the strength and the hope to keep moving forward. Because now these stories are not just in this book, they're in documentaries, they are in news articles, they are the sites that are mentioned in here, the homes, they are on the National Historic Registers. We have made it so that it is harder and harder to ignore these stories. We have the tools that our ancestors, and I'm talking about all of us within here, our ancestors gave us these tools, and we've learned about them. Now let's put them to use. Let's use them and never let anyone forget how important it is to speak up for each other and to tell each other stories and to spread those stories, because when you only hear one side of a story, you're going to stereotype other people, look down upon other people, not see them as human beings that they are. But when we look and see that we're all a part of this, we can make major changes together. And that's what this book and the themes that come out in this book inspired me to keep on pushing.
Thank you. I don't want to leave the impression that this book is entirely about politics, because it's a lot about churches, about public education, about private education, about many other subjects, including entrepreneurs and the building of civic institutions that at the end of the 19th century created what we are calling a segregated economy, a separate collection of black professional educators, lawyers, businessmen, bankers, newspaper publishers, parallel to the white establishment, but invisible to the white establishment, because this is also the time when mandatory racial segregation of residential areas is first being imposed. There is one major political arc, however, that spans the entire period that this narrative comes, and I want to go back to what John Deal said earlier about give us the vote and we can secure our rights. At the very beginning, black Virginians were organizing politically, even before the Civil War was over, so that by the middle of the summer of 1865, they were able to hold a state convention. They all insisted on the right to vote. They all insisted on, we are now free, we are American citizens, we are entitled to all the rights of citizenship, which frankly scared the hell out of the traditional white elites. It's understandable. Many of these people had been their property. They'd treated them as subhuman in many respects. So this political activism, these black people seizing the initiative, was really an astonishing thing. And it instantly created opposition, a backlash, if you will. The black people persisted. They seized control of their own lives. Unlike what I learned 50 several years ago when I was first studying Virginia history, and all of the books that old white men wrote said that the black politicians were under the control of radical white Northerners. They were trying to destroy Virginia's way of life. And it was all a failure because the black people were incompetent. That just ain't true. We should have known from the beginning that wasn't true. But the historical record, which we have all now seen, demonstrates that black people took the initiative from the very beginning. They charted their own political course. When they could get white allies, they achieved things. When they couldn't get white allies, or when the white Republicans that were supposed to be controlling them disappointed them, they took their own course and went separate ways. They pursued their objectives straight through. There are two times where they had major success. You know, unlike in South Carolina and some other places in the former Confederacy, black people were never a majority in the General Assembly of Virginia or in the Constitutional Convention, and only in a very few instances in a majority in a local government. But there were sympathetic white people out there. Many of them had been loyal to the United States throughout the Civil War, or had moved to Virginia from a northern state after the Civil War, or were flexible enough to realize that that old Virginia was dead, and it was time to build a new Virginia for everybody, and to recognize that the black demand for the right to vote and the right for full citizenship rights was a just demand. So in the Constitutional Convention, the 24 black delegates out of 103 or 4 or 5 members had some major successes. The chief one, of course, being getting the right to vote for all black men and establishing the state's very first system of free public education for all children. The white political structure was very opposed to that, opposed to it all the way through the remainder of the century, with one brief exception at the end of the 1870s and the beginning of the 1880s, where a strange political party formed called the Readjusters. They wanted to readjust the way in which the state paid its public debt, because too much tax money was going to pay the interest on the debt. That money was going to bond speculators in London. And the Readjusters, which included a large number of white people as well as black people, asked voters a question. Do you want your tax money to go to pay bond speculators in London, or do you want it to go to your public schools? The government had cut funding for public schools about in half in order to continue paying interest on the debt. White Virginians and black Virginians united in a biracial political party and took over the state government for 4 years. They readjusted the debt. They did a great many other things that were of interest to black constituents. They abolished the whipping post. They created this country's first public mental hospital for black people. They created what has become Virginia State University, which I think was the first publicly supported black institution of higher education in the country. This was a major set of reforms. There was more reforms passed during the 1881 General Assembly session than anyone before, and probably anyone since. But then here's what happened. The white readjusters who agreed with the black readjusters about putting more money in the schools refinanced the debt, gave the money to the schools, and turned their backs on their black allies. White supremacy took charge over cooperation. This very short, unique in American history, biracial coalition called the Readjusters succeeded and then immediately dissolved when the white people pulled out. And the remainder of the century, almost 2 decades, is a story of white political leaders, white supremacists, undertaking a deliberate and largely successful campaign to disfranchise black voters, so that by the time of the Constitutional Convention of 1902, about 90% of black voters had lost the right to vote. That's a heavy price for citizens to pay. Hell, they even made white citizens pay the same price to achieve that objective, because not only did they disfranchise about 90% of black voters, they disfranchised nearly half of white voters in the process. It was no longer possible for blacks to pursue their objectives politically. They pursued them economically and educationally, and created the institutions at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that enabled the great civil rights generation that began in the 1920s and 30s to have its footing, have its political organizing, and make a very great success. So I'm talking too long about this, but this is, to me, is a fundamentally important point, that it's the black people taking the lead. It just proves it was a lie, all that stuff that I read when I was a kid. And even when I was a graduate student at the beginning of the 1970s, this was still the prevailing interpretation in many places. Before we get to audience questions, I would like to ask John and Deal and Mary Julian if there are some, what they think we should take away from this book. I just told them what I think.
Well, I think part of it is what you were saying earlier, Brent, about the institutions that were created in this latter 19th century. The educational institutions, of course, but the economic, the fraternal order, the beneficial life insurance companies, and that kind of thing. And I think and those leaders carry on into and the leaders and institutions carry on into the 20th century. Obviously, the story is still yet to be is still obviously going on. And I think part of it is, so we tried for us to write this in, the buzzword is an accessible narrative, right? For general audiences and not so much for the academics and that kind of thing. But there's a lot here that I think the depth and the breadth of the stories, I think, can serve academics and is also useful in the classroom. For readers, and Brent brought up the readjusters, and Brent has written more on the readjusters than anybody. The way we approach the readjusters and other sorts of things, as Mary alluded to, is from an African American's perspective. So we're not talking about the readjusters from Billy Mahone's perspective or all of his white cronies. It's from the African American legislative perspective. And we do the same thing for talking about Jackson Ward. We all know Jackson Ward on some level, especially in the city. But we tried to put it in those voices, as Mary alluded to earlier. And it's people will ask, is it a hopeful story? Is it a not hopeful story? Well, it's certainly an unfinished story. But I think it's also a realistic one as well, in terms of where we finish with the divide separate economy that flourishes in its separateness, which of course is not the goal, and being shut out politically. So that's what I would hope that folks take away is a different, looking at all of these things from a different lens and a different perspective than they have either been exposed to or not exposed to at all.
And like Congresswoman was saying, these cycles of, a step forward, a couple steps back, it seems to happen. In this book, we see what happens, when you lose the vote, when you disfranchise a lot of people, it takes generations to get that back, which I hope people think about now when we see these, things happening in different states around the country. Fortunately, when the Congresswoman was in the Senate and, sponsored the Virginia Voting Rights Act, fortunately, Virginia is, keeping, with allies, but, trying to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen. But it is something to remember, going forward. And also, just to take away from this, this is only a piece of the story. There is so much more to learn out there, in different communities around the state. What people were doing to, build these, mutual aid societies and businesses, educators. There's a lot more out there to learn. So I hope that people will keep doing that work.
Well, I thank all of you. We want to leave some time for audience questions and the like. If you have a question or a comment, please come to one of the microphones so that everybody can hear the question and we won't have to repeat the question before we answer it.
I just wanted to make one comment. I have the privilege of having read an earlier draft of the book. There are so many accounts, and I am a native Virginian, of Virginia's role in slavery and individual accounts of what it was like to live in slavery. I think the thing that I love about this book is two things. First of all, if you can imagine what it must have been like to grow up as a slave with all of the barriers and walls and limitations, and then you are free. The clarity with which so many of the formerly enslaved saw immediately what needed to be done and how they could do it is shocking. A clear vision, a direct line. So many of these people who are outlined in this book absolutely saw what needed to be done, and they saw it immediately. The second thing that I love about this book, and of course it's not all good news, as the panelists have certainly outlined, but the rapidity with which, given half an opportunity, how people established schools, established self-help, bought land, made money, preserved money, talked to other community members, redressed wrongs, and absolutely went forward at a pace that I find very, very surprising. So those two things, I think, make this book, part of this book, very positive and enlightening. The clarity and the rapidity.
Well, that's not a question, but it's a very nice endorsement. Thank you.
First, thank you for the book. But secondly, you've admitted something. You were lied to. And so who has enough capital, political, theological, educational, to tell people your parents lied to you, your pastor lied to you, your teacher lied to you, and then culture enforced that lie? Because in this room, we heard it, but there are millions out there who are not going to read the book and not going to hear it, but continue to live the lie.
Yeah, and you know, much of what we got taught was not originally, when the ideas were dreamed up right after the end of the Civil War, they were deliberate distortions or lies. But then there are several generations of people who never heard the real story, and they repeat the old story. It's not that they're telling lies deliberately, but they're repeating the same old stuff over and over, and it works exactly the same way.
Listen, real quick, I'll add that when I was in school, I was grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, and I was in the first class to go through all 12 years of all 12 years of school, and fully not integrated, desegregated.
Yep. Yep.
Let me say that again. Fully desegregated school system. And the book that we came in under was that book that when you flipped it open, it was it had pictures of the enslaved people landing in Jamestown with dresses and suitcases. Okay? And that's where black people fit in. My teachers spoke against that. You know, they were teaching us the right things, but having to use a book that was perpetuating all those, repeating all those things that had been gone before. And that causes dissonance. Because if you're in a household that says, oh, you are worthy, that you can achieve, and look what your ancestor did, and look what we expect you to do, yet when you get out into the rest of the world, you're getting a completely different message, and everybody's getting that complete different message. How do you deal with that as a young person? And knowing that education is the way to move forward, that's hard. And it took me till now to really feel that I can straddle those worlds and help educate people and teach what I've learned, what I know they've learned because I was immersed in it being full Virginian.
So I'm Gen X, born 1972, went to a high school, elementary, middle school, and high school that were 50-50 white and black. First member of my family to say that. And part of why I have taken on the responsibility of telling these stories is because not experiencing Jim Crow gives me the freedom to tell those stories from a place of joy, whereas for the generation that experienced Jim Crow, it's from a place of pain that they're still dealing with. One of the things I'm very excited about being in Congress and being a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, we meet every Wednesday when we're in DC, and on the agenda is the Clyburn moment. And being able to serve with Jim Clyburn and hear him tell his stories. But he moved me to tears the week after he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And he's talking to us about what that meant to him. And he's written at least, I think, 2 books, and he's got a 3rd one he's working on. And he said in that meeting, there are still stories I haven't told that I don't know if I'll ever tell. I had no idea how involved my own father and grandfather were in the civil rights movement till after my father died and I was going through his papers, because he kept everything. Everything, even receipts for lunch. And so my quick second story, and this is public now, so I can say it, but who do you think taught Ralph Northam the history of blackface?
Good question.
And when I explained to him the history of blackface, he got this look on his face and he said, why didn't I know that? Because he grew up, he integrated a black school. His best friend was black. I said, Governor, you were 10 years old. Your father didn't tell you that your family owned slaves until you were running for governor as an adult. You were 10. And your best friend's family shielded him from what he was experiencing, what they were experiencing, just like your father shielded you from what your family did. And who lives, who dies, who tells your story. And I'm going to admit, sometimes you feel like, why, as a black woman in America, is the burden on me to tell these stories? But it's not a burden, it's a privilege. It is a privilege because I am a history maker standing on the shoulders of everybody who, in my family and beyond, who fought and in some cases died to put me in the United States Capitol that was built, could have been built by my own ancestors. I owe it to them to tell their story because they can't, and they didn't. And when they tried to, they were persecuted. But it can't just be on us. And for a lot of white people, it's uncomfortable. And that's okay, because in any family, when you've had a family trauma, you don't heal unless you talk about it. And saying, well, I'm not going to teach this to my children because they might get uncomfortable. I don't want my granddaughter to see me screaming in this elementary school kid's face in a book because she's integrating the school that I went to. But we gotta. If we don't have these hard conversations, these stories won't get told and we'll never fully heal as a nation.
Before we break up for a book signing, we have time for one more question if it's short and one more answer if it's short.
Well, I hope my question is short. Thank you. My question was, you outlined how the book, sort of uncovers this history of Black economic empowerment as well as political empowerment. And we know that, for instance, the Virginia General Assembly, since Jennifer McClellan was there, has actually gained so many more Black members, which is really wonderful. But a lot of the efforts to dismantle Black economic empowerment are still echoing here today. So for instance, Jackson Ward, which you mentioned, Professor Deal, is that, it was really damaged by urban renewal and running 95 through it. So how do we, build that back up now?
I think part of it is sort of dovetailing with the earlier question is it's incremental. We're not going to be able to change things overnight. And it's works like it's the book that we worked on. It's Congresswoman McClellan and Ajena educating people. It's folks and my colleagues here at the Library of Virginia doing public history. So it's that incremental, and it is sort of pushing that pebble, up the mountain in the one step forward and 2 steps back kind of thing. I mean, I think there's no magic pill, as much as we want there to be. And I think that's what's frustrating, because we can all see it. It's like, how come you can't see it? How come it's right there. That's how we can change it. But as we are learning, obviously, that's not the way. Yeah, and you want to talk about trying to explain to people about what Jackson Ward was prior to the highway. That's a particular Richmond thing.
First, I just want to thank all of y'all for both writing this book, but also bringing it forward. But I think it's really important. We have stopped talking about slaves, and we've started talking about enslaved people. And this is part of the narrative. There was nothing different about those people than the white people who owned them, except how much money they had and whether they were paid for their work. And that's something that I think, as an African American, it's important for us to understand. I applaud the work, but our lives were full of meaning just because we didn't have the power of agency over our, And I think especially, I work with young people, right? And for so many of them, they're so cut off from what it means to have come up through this, what's been taken from them, from us. But we've been living and thriving and doing. And just thank you for surfacing these particular stories. But for all of us, that's the takeaway. Black people have been living and working and building lives and having children and making a difference and building institutions since we got here. It's just that systems get in the way, and white folks don't like sharing power and being nice sometimes. But who we are is resistance and resilience and love. So anyhow, thank you.
Thank you. We did not talk about it very much, but we included quite a lot in the book about families being reunited after the end of slavery, about the importance of families, about the importance of churches and various community organizations through which people lived their lives in a totally non-political context. It's too easy to get sidestepped onto the politics of that because it's very interesting, but these other things are extraordinarily important too. Well, we thank all of you for coming, and we thank you for very excellent questions.